Every Sunday morning he climbed the bell tower to ring the call to worship, while watching donation collection through eyes that had tracked charity fraud for 16 years. What the congregation didn't know was that the devoted bell ringer ensuring their spiritual gatherings had once been the investigator who specialized in exposing the very nonprofit embezzlement now stealing money meant for helping the poor and needy. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of protecting charitable giving from those who would steal from the vulnerable, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. St. Joseph's Catholic Church had served the downtown community for 87 years, its Gothic bell tower rising above the neighborhood like a beacon of hope for families who found comfort in weekly worship and community fellowship. The church operated extensive charitable programs, collecting donations that funded soup kitchens, homeless shelters, and assistance programs for families struggling with poverty, illness, and economic hardship. Thomas McCarthy had been the church's volunteer bell ringer for 5 years, climbing the narrow stone steps every Sunday morning to ring the bronze bells that called the faithful to worship. At 64, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired office worker who had discovered a deep spiritual calling to serve his church community through the ancient tradition of bell ringing that marked sacred time and gathered people in prayer. But Thomas's observation of church operations went far beyond normal volunteer service. While most church volunteers focused on liturgical duties, community outreach, and spiritual fellowship, Thomas automatically monitored donation handling, charitable fund management, and administrative procedures with the trained eye of someone who understood how nonprofit organizations could be exploited for personal enrichment rather than charitable service. What the congregation didn't know was that Thomas McCarthy had never been an office worker. For 16 years, he'd been Senior Investigator Thomas McCarthy, Nonprofit Fraud Division, specializing in charity embezzlement cases, donation theft investigations, and situations where criminals used religious and charitable organizations to steal money intended for vulnerable populations who depended on charitable giving for basic survival needs. His retirement 5 years ago had been earned through over a decade and a half of investigating crimes that destroyed charitable organizations. His ability to recognize nonprofit fraud patterns had been permanent. "Beautiful service today, Thomas," said Father Rodriguez after the 10 a.m. Mass, as Thomas descended from the bell tower where he'd just finished ringing the closing bells. "The donations were particularly generous this morning." "That's wonderful," Thomas replied, but his trained eye had already noted discrepancies in the collection counting process that suggested systematic diversion of charitable donations from their intended purposes. What bothered Thomas wasn't normal administrative variations. Churches often needed flexibility in managing charitable funds to respond to changing community needs. What concerned him was the pattern of donation handling that indicated systematic embezzlement rather than legitimate charitable administration. From his position in the bell tower, Thomas had an unobstructed view of the entire sanctuary, including the collection process, administrative areas, and the interactions between church staff and board members responsible for managing charitable funds. Over the past month, he'd observed financial activities that matched embezzlement techniques he'd seen in nonprofit fraud investigations. "Thomas," said Maria Santos, the church's volunteer coordinator who managed community outreach programs, "we've had to reduce some of our assistance programs due to budget constraints. The donations just aren't covering our charitable commitments like they used to." Thomas had heard this exact explanation hundreds of times during nonprofit fraud investigations. Reduced charitable services blamed on decreased donations when the real cause was embezzlement by people trusted to manage funds intended for vulnerable populations. "What kind of budget constraints?" Thomas asked. though he already suspected the problem wasn't decreased giving, but systematic theft of charitable donations. Administrative costs have increased significantly, and we're having trouble tracking exactly where some of the donated funds are being allocated. The bookkeeping has become complicated. Thomas's training immediately activated. Complicated bookkeeping and increased administrative costs that couldn't be clearly tracked were classic indicators of charity embezzlement designed to obscure the theft of donations. That evening, Thomas did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He called a number that connected him to people who still investigated the crimes he'd once specialized in preventing. Nonprofit Fraud Division, Investigator Angela Rodriguez speaking. "Angela, this is Thomas McCarthy." There was a pause. "Thomas, how's the church volunteer work treating you?" "Spiritually," Thomas said, sitting at his kitchen table with donation records and financial observations that looked like normal volunteer notes but represented potential evidence of systematic charity embezzlement. "Angela, I need to report suspected nonprofit fraud involving charitable donation theft." Investigator Rodriguez had worked with Thomas for 7 years before his retirement. She knew that when Thomas McCarthy called about suspected nonprofit fraud, it meant charitable organizations were being exploited to steal money from programs that served the most vulnerable members of society. "What are you seeing?" Thomas provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in nonprofit fraud investigations. Financial patterns, donation handling irregularities, administrative cost increases, and accounting techniques that suggested organized embezzlement of charitable funds rather than legitimate nonprofit management. "Thomas," Rodriguez said after he finished, "will coordinate with state charity oversight and religious organization monitoring units. Can you maintain normal volunteer activities while we develop the investigation?" "Affirmative," Thomas said, "but they're accelerating the embezzlement. Based on the financial patterns and charitable program cuts, they're planning to steal the entire annual assistance fund before the next fiscal audit." What happened next was 16 years of nonprofit fraud investigation expertise compressed into the most important bell-ringing service of Thomas's civilian life. He returned to St. Joseph's the following Sunday, not just as a volunteer bell ringer calling people to worship, but as an experienced investigator conducting surveillance in an environment where criminals thought their charity fraud was invisible among legitimate religious and charitable activities. Over the next 2 months, Thomas coordinated with investigator Rodriguez's team to document comprehensive charity embezzlement involving donation theft, falsified assistance records, and systematic stealing of money intended to provide food, shelter, and emergency assistance to families in crisis. "We've arrested 4 suspects, including 2 church board members," Rodriguez told him during a briefing at the church after the operation concluded. The embezzlement network was stealing over $150,000 annually from charitable donations while filing false reports, claiming the money was being used for community assistance programs. "Impact on charitable services?" Thomas asked. The stolen funds were supposed to provide emergency food assistance to over 200 families monthly and shelter support for dozens of homeless individuals. Your identification of the fraud pattern prevented the complete destruction of charitable programs that vulnerable community members depended on for survival. The investigation revealed that the charity embezzlement network had been operating for over 4 years, systematically stealing donations while reducing charitable services and blaming funding shortfalls on decreased community giving rather than criminal theft. Local news covered the story as a major charity fraud bust by nonprofit oversight authorities, with no mention of the church bell ringer who had recognized the embezzlement patterns or the nonprofit fraud veteran who had provided the expertise that protected charitable donations meant for vulnerable populations. A few weeks later, The diocese approached Thomas about developing enhanced oversight protocols for parish financial management. "Mr. McCarthy," said Diocesan Financial Officer Patricia Williams, "we understand you have extensive experience in nonprofit financial administration." Thomas looked around St. Joseph's sanctuary, where families could again trust that their charitable donations would actually help feed hungry children and shelter homeless individuals, where community assistance programs could serve people in need rather than enriching criminals who exploited religious trust. "Some," he said simply, "we'd like to implement stronger oversight procedures for parish charitable fund management. Would you be willing to help develop those protocols?" "Of course," Thomas replied. Charitable giving represents people's desire to help those less fortunate, especially when donations are given through religious organizations that people trust to serve vulnerable populations rather than exploit them. What the diocesan officer didn't know was that she'd just asked one of the region's most experienced charity fraud investigators to design oversight systems for protecting religious charitable giving from exactly the kind of embezzlement Thomas had spent his career fighting. Thomas never told the congregation about his nonprofit fraud investigation background or the charity embezzlement networks he'd dismantled. He never mentioned the donation theft schemes he'd prosecuted or the religious organizations he'd helped expose for stealing money intended for vulnerable populations. He just rang the church bells every Sunday, called the faithful to worship, and quietly watched for financial patterns that indicated criminals were stealing charitable donations from programs designed to serve the poor, hungry, and homeless. But word spread through nonprofit oversight circles that if anyone noticed unusual financial patterns or suspected charity fraud at religious organizations, they should probably consult with the bell ringer at St. Joseph's Church. Not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how charitable embezzlement operations worked. Every Sunday morning at 9:45 a.m., Thomas continued his climb to the bell tower. He rang the ancient bronze bells that had called people to worship for generations, maintained the sacred tradition of marking holy time, and monitored the church's operations with the kind of vigilant observation that had kept him at the forefront of charity fraud investigation for over a decade and a half. Most Sundays, the biggest challenge was timing the bell sequences correctly and ensuring that the sacred music properly called people to prayer and reflection. But some Sundays, when his trained instincts detected patterns that indicated charity embezzlement, Thomas McCarthy was exactly where he needed to be, between charitable donations and criminals who would steal money meant for feeding hungry families and sheltering homeless individuals. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career investigating charity fraud. You don't stop protecting vulnerable populations when you retire. You just find a new way to ensure that charitable giving serves those in need rather than enriching criminals. And sometimes the most important nonprofit fraud prevention in a community is provided by someone who looks like they're just ringing church bells, but who knows exactly what charity embezzlement looks like and refuses to let criminals steal from organizations that serve the most vulnerable members of society. Thomas had spent 16 years investigating networks that destroyed charitable organizations by stealing money intended for hungry, homeless, and desperate individuals. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one church remained a place where charitable donations actually served vulnerable populations rather than enriching embezzlers who exploited religious trust. The mission was the same. The charitable funds were the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating charity fraud after vulnerable populations were harmed, he was preventing embezzlement by recognizing the patterns before criminals could steal money intended for community assistance. And every Sunday, as the bronze bells called people to worship and families dropped donations into collection plates, trusting that their giving would help those in need, Thomas McCarthy rang with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between legitimate charitable administration and criminal theft of donations, ready to protect both the church and the vulnerable populations that depended on charitable giving for survival. So the next time you hear church bells calling people to worship, remember that the person ringing them might have expertise far beyond religious service. The volunteer ensuring your spiritual gathering might be the same person who spent their career investigating criminals who steal from charitable organizations meant to serve the poor and needy. Have you ever met someone like Thomas? Someone whose volunteer work perfectly positioned them to protect charitable giving using their professional expertise? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop ensuring that donations serve vulnerable populations rather than enriching criminals. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting charitable giving from embezzlement. Because the world needs more people like Thomas McCarthy, professionals who understand that some protection is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear investigator badges and prosecute charity fraud. Sometimes they ring church bells and watch for donation theft. But they're always protecting charitable giving from criminal exploitation, always ensuring that donations serve vulnerable populations rather than enriching embezzlers. And sometimes the most important charity protection in your community comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how nonprofit fraud works and refuses to let criminals steal from any organization dedicated to serving those who depend on charitable giving for survival.